One of the most brutal concentration camps of the Second World War was Dachau. It was a camp which was first opened by the Nazis, and during the time in which it was opened, it's believed that around 41,500 people died within the barbed wire fences. Dachau became the prototype for the concentration camps that were opened, and that became so destructive, but when the camp was liberated by the Americans, there were a series of executions and killings of the guards who worked there. The SS guards of Dachau were known for their brutality and evil, but the Dachau Liberation Reprisals, as it was known, saw an American soldier fire at the former SS guards, and there was a huge investigation around this. Around the whole of Dachau, there were many other guards who had been killed in the camp, but what was the true story has become rather muddled. Join us today as we look at the ruthless executions of the guards of Dachau, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Dachau was opened on the 22nd of March 1933, and to begin with it held 200 prisoners sent from Stadelheim prison and Landsberg, and it was the first camp to hold inmates who were regarded as political prisoners. As time went on and the Nazis' stranglehold over Germany increased, thousands more people were sent there, including those who were considered undesirable by the Nazis. As soon as the camp opened, there were many deaths that occurred there and prisoners were being killed. The prisoners were forced to conduct hard labour, and it became a site where many SS guards were trained before they were dispatched to other camps to work. The prisoner entrance was marked by the infamous phrase Arbeit macht frei, and the camp then became very overcrowded. It was a site which was synonymous with execution, as around 4,000 Soviet prisoners of war were executed there by the Commandant's guards at the SS shooting range near to the camp, and executions of prisoners continued. Guards were known for their brutality, and they would beat and brutalise the inmates if they caught them not being productive enough, and they would execute and slaughter with their bare hands. Executions also took place at roll call on the gallows in front of the camp's inmates, and they would strike terror into the hearts of the prisoners. There was also a women's camp that opened in August 1944, but as the Second World War turned against the Germans, the conditions at Dachau went downhill badly. The Germans started to move prisoners from concentration camps nearer the front lines to more centrally found camps nearer to the German heartland, and with this thousands of prisoners were sent to Dachau. Because of this, there were many typhus epidemics and other disease outbreaks which caused problems, and there were poor sanitary conditions coupled with a lack of food and water. This led to many prisoners dying, and it's believed that around 15,000 people died in the final 6 months of the war at Dachau, and each day hundreds were succumbing to the conditions, as well as those who were being brought to the firing range to be executed. But in the final days of the camp, prisoners were still arriving, and the SS would confiscate food, which was given to the prisoners on death marches, and on the marches hundreds were dying. The SS would dump the bodies in a ravine and would force locals to bury them, but on the 24th of April 1945, days before liberation, the Commandant of Dachau ordered 7,000 prisoners on a death march from the camp. Those who would not keep up on the 6-day march were shot, but at the time of liberation 200 people a day were dying. Himmler would initially order no prisoners to fall into the hands of the enemy, and those from the northern part of Germany were ordered to be drowned in the North Sea or the Baltic, but at Dachau the SS began to erase any information regarding what was actually happening at the camp. But on the 29th of April 1945, soldiers from the 3rd Battalion 157th Infantry Regiment, 45th Infantry Division, who were led by Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, began to approach the huge Dachau complex and the nearby subcamps. On their approach they came across 29 different train boxcars, which had 2,000 people's remains inside, and it was clear they had been brutally exhibited and executed by the SS. The smell of the rotting bodies and the sight of the emaciated dead caused a huge amount of discomfort, upset and horror with the minds and emotions of the American soldiers. This may have had an impact on the events that came later. But as the Americans approached, they ordered the SS guards to surrender, but some fired upon the Americans. As they pushed forward into prisoner areas, the Americans found more bodies who had been dead for some time, and they had just been left in the open with no dignity. But the soldiers then came across the prisoners who were alive and were dying. But then the decision to surrender the camp was made, and the majority of the SS hierarchy and the guards who had fled the camp had gone missing. One senior guard, Heinrich Wicker, was slaughtered by the prisoners after the surrender, and he was left in charge with 560 guards at his disposal. But on the 29th of April the camp was surrendered, and the job then came to try and save the lives of those who were starving. One liberator would state of the scenes, "As we approached the southwest corner, 3 people came forward with a flag of truce. We met them about 75 yards north of the southwest corner. These 3 people were Swiss Red Cross representatives, Victor Maurer and 2 SS troops, who said they were the camp commander and his assistant. They had come here on the night of the 28th to take over from the regular camp personnel for the purpose of surrendering the camp to the advancing Americans. The Swiss Red Cross representative said there were around 100 SS guards in the camp who had their arms stacked except for the people in the tower. He had given instructions that there would be no shots fired, and it would take 50 men to relieve the guards, as there were 42,000 half-crazed inmates, many of them typhus infected. He asked if I was an officer. I replied, I am Assistant Division Commander of the 42nd Infantry Division, and will accept the surrender of the camp in the name of the Rainbow Division for the United States Army. But regarding the capture of Dachau, Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, would issue a statement that said, "Our forces liberated and mopped up the infamous concentration camp at Dachau. Approximately 32,000 prisoners were liberated, and 300 SS camp guards were quickly neutralised." But the circumstances around how the SS guards were killed has been debated, and some historians have argued that the war crime was committed by the American soldiers. One historian stated of what happened that the Americans came on April 29th for Sunday. Work had stopped in the camp on Wednesday, and an evacuation was being organised. One transport of 4,000 prisoners was able to get away, but the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions covered the 40 miles from the Danube faster than the Germans expected. At noon on Sunday the camp was quiet, and the SS guards were in their posts at the towers when the cry "Americans" went up. A prisoner rushed towards a gate and a guard shot him. Outside, a single American soldier stood looking casually at the towers, while the guards eyed him, and the others, who were 200 or 300 yards away. When the Americans opened fire, the guards in the gate tower came down, hands in the air. One held a pistol behind his back, and the first American shot him. In the next few minutes a jeep drove up, in it a blonde female war correspondent and a chaplain. The chaplain asked the prisoners now crowding the gate to join him in the Lord's Prayer. Troops of the 42nd and 45th Divisions who liberated Dachau in the afternoon on the 29th of April were fighting in Munich the next morning, and by nightfall had, along with the 15 Corps, other 3 divisions, captured the city that was the capital of Bavaria and the birthplace of Nazism. But what actually happened with the executions of the Dachau liberation reprisals is best told by the men who were there and who witnessed it. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks stated that he saw around 50 German prisoners who had been captured, former guards, and that they were then taken to an area which had been used for storing coal. The area was enclosed in an L shape by a wall, which was around 8 feet high, and it was found next to the camp infirmary. The prisoners of war were watched over by American soldiers and a machine gun team, who had their weapons primed as a threat for them not to move. Sparks then left these soldiers, and as he walked away he heard a soldier shout, "They're trying to get away," and then machine gun fire was heard. Sparks quickly returned, and he came across a 19-year-old soldier, nicknamed Birdie, who was manning the machine gun, and he had shot 12 of the prisoners and wounded many more. The gunner was crying and was beside himself, and Sparks later said of the incident, "It was the foregoing incident which could have given rise to wild claims in various publications that most or all of the German prisoners captured at Dachau were executed. Nothing could be further from the truth. The total number of German guards killed at Dachau during that day most certainly did not exceed 50, with 30 probably being a more accurate figure. The regimental records for that date indicate that over 1,000 German prisoners were brought to the regimental collecting point. Since my task force was leaving the regimental attack, almost all the prisoners were taken by task force, including several hundred from Dachau. But there was some debate as to whether the soldier had been told to fire, or how many German soldiers or guards were actually killed. One witness testimony said that around 4 p.m. in the afternoon, he arrived in the yard where the Germans had been shot, and that around 15 or 16 were killed, and the wounded were lying up against the wall. Some of the wounded were moving, and the surgeon and doctor did not know if any medical assistance had been called for, meaning that the Americans were happy to let the wounded suffer and succumb to their deaths and fates. But other accounts would go further, saying that the Nazis were rounded up and were executed along with their guard dogs by the American forces in the coal yard. There were further executions that took place, and the prisoners would get their revenge on the guards following the liberation. One prisoner stated that the prisoners swarmed over the wire and grabbed the Americans and lifted them onto their shoulders. Other prisoners caught the SS men. The first SS man elbowed one or two prisoners out the way. With the courage of the prisoners mounted, they knocked them down and nobody could see whether they were stomped or what, but they were killed. The prisoner functionaries such as the Carpos were also beaten and were killed being attacked with fists and other weapons. One German guard was beaten to death with a shovel, and there were further incidents in which the American soldiers turned a blind eye to inmates beating the former guards to death. One witness said that after an attack, there was not much left of an SS guard's face, noting the hate the prisoners held in their hearts. But there was an investigation into the killings of the guards of Dachau, and witnesses came forward about what happened. Further information came to light regarding more deaths, with 4 German soldiers being shot in a boxcar, and these men had surrendered and they were given a coup de grace, which was given to the wounded. Also, further accounts about SS men being shot by the Americans in different enclosures were spoken about, and the investigation resulted in possible court-martials, but charges were later dismissed. It was considered a violation of international law, but no one really ever answered the charges for it. The Dachau Liberation Reprisals, as they were known, were a series of executions and killings of those SS men who were responsible for the huge suffering and evil that occurred inside of Dachau. They were people who were responsible for the thousands of dead at the camp, and they did little to help the suffering. But the executions that were carried out around the camp were a sign of the anger and horror that the Americans held these men in. It's likely that they were affected by the mass bodies and the horror that they encountered at Dachau, and this is why some of them turned a blind eye to the reprisals and killings. But inside of the liberated camp, between 35 and 50 SS guards were executed. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.